Let's step into our time machine and go back to the year 1936, which is the year that the modern polling industry began. It's an election year. The candidates, the incumbent is President Franklin Roosevelt, who's running for re-election. He's the Democrat candidate. The Republicans nominated Alf Landon, who was the very popular governor of the state of Kansas. And since it's an election year, they did an election poll. Yawn, I hear you saying. Of course they did a poll. Well, nowadays polls are ubiquitous, but back in 1936 they were actually a pretty uncommon occurrence. In fact, there was really only one poll. It was run by a magazine called the Literary Digest, which was a news magazine. They had begun their polls back in 1916, and they called the 1916 election correctly. They called the 1920 election correctly. They called the 1924 election correctly, and 1928 and 1932. So they've got a good track record for accuracy here. And for the 1936 election, they surveyed 10 million voters. And based upon their survey of 10 million voters, they predicted that Alf Landon would be elected president by a fairly hefty 57 to 43 majority. Was Alf Landon elected president? Alf Landon did not come even close to being elected president. Alf Landon carried Maine and Vermont, period. He got trounced. The biggest landslide in modern presidential electoral history. Literary Digest, by the way, was so discredited by this result that they went bankrupt within a few months, which says something about the consequences of doing bad statistics. But there's a hero to our story, and the hero is, of course, a statistician by the name of George Gallup. This is George Gallup Sr. George Gallup Jr. is currently running the family business. George Gallup had gotten his PhD in psychology, and he was particularly interested in looking at how people formed and expressed their opinions. And he got his start in political polling in 1934 in statewide elections in the state of Iowa. He did polls for Mrs. Alex Miller. In 1934, a married woman would run under her married name. She was a candidate for Secretary of State in Iowa and wound up being the first woman elected to statewide office in Iowa. She was also Gallup's mother-in-law. So 1936 rolls around. He wants to make a splash on the national stage, and he does two things. The first thing he does is he predicts in advance what the Literary Digest result will be. Gallup predicts they're going to call it 56-44, which was actually pretty close to the actual result. Gallup made this prediction in July before the Literary Digest even started their survey. They were not happy. He also predicted the actual election result. He predicted it 56-44 for Roosevelt, and while he wasn't nearly as close on this, he actually got the winner correct. And that leaves us then to two questions. What did the Literary Digest do that was so incredibly wrong? And what did Gallup do to get it right? We'll look at the answer to those two questions in the next